Okay, so yeah, progress traps. A look into the work of historian Ronald Wright. We're going to start by looking at what many people call the modern era as an age of hockey stick graphs. I'm going to explain what that means. We're going to look at several hockey stick graphs. But the idea is that when you take a long kind of historical look at humanity during the past 10,000 years, 100,000 years, you see generally a very flat line for many indicators of well-being, whether it be population, et cetera. And then in modern times, we see an explosion. So the age of hockey stick graphs is an idea that the modern era in which we live truly is an anomaly. And there is something categorically different, qualitatively and quantitatively different about the times we're living in today. Um, and then we're going to start looking at the book, Ronald Wright's A Short History of Progress, this book right here. And he starts by saying that progress is kind of the mythos. It's the modern day myth, the mythos of modernity. And I'm going to explain what that means. Then we're going to take a look at what he means by progress traps. Again, the idea that progress is not necessarily this modern day certainty of unequivocal beneficence, right? That there is drawbacks, that there are drawbacks to progress. And Ronald Wright takes a look at what progress traps are. We'll look at a few historical examples of what those are in past human societies and civilizations. Take a quick look at some of the possible causes of these progress traps. And then end with a few ideas, quotes from other thinkers as well, about how we can reimagine what progress might look like in a way that helps us to avoid some of the negative progress traps, the drawbacks, etc. All right, so progress is the mythos of modernity. This is a picture of Winston Churchill, the famous president or prime minister of the United Kingdom during World War II. And him and his generation, especially the people who led the world during the end of World War II and the beginning of the true beginning of the modern era. I mean, you can place when modernity really started in several different places, but you definitely see in the post-World War II era an explosion of economic growth, an explosion of technological capacity. It was the beginning of the computer era. We had had fossil fuels for a long time, but it was really when fossil fuel growth really took off and impacted, the consumer sector. Standards of living started to explode around the world. The post-World War II era was also when the age of development really began to take off. The idea that there was kind of one standard of living that everybody around the world should aspire to. Harry Truman, who was the president of the United States at the time, has some really great quotes that for the first time, the enterprise of developed nations was to share their wealth and their pathway towards what they considered to be a good life with the rest of the world. And Winston Churchill, shortly after the end of World War II, has this interesting quote, which kind of embodies this idea that progress is kind of the mythos, the pseudo religion of modernity. He says, "Every day you may make progress. Every step may be fruitful, yet there will stretch out before you an ever lengthening, ever ascending, ever improving path. You know you will never get to the end of the journey, but this, so far from discouraging, only adds to the joy and the glory of the climb." So the idea that progress is the mythos of modernity is kind of this idea that has been embedded into the mindsets of humanity for the past couple hundred years, and especially for the past two or three generations. Those who were born, the baby boomer generation, those who came to age in the explosion of wealth and consumer power of the post-World War II years or post-World War II era. There is this idea that humanity is on this upward climb, right? That we are moving forward into greater heights, into better futures, into a future of our own creation, right? For the past 200 years, one of the defining differences affecting humanity is the belief that the lives of our children will be quantitatively better than our own, that they will have more things, more wealth, more energy, that they will live longer, they will be healthier, they will travel farther, etc. And I think it's important to again try and take a step outside of the historical era in which we live and understand from a historical perspective that this is an anomaly, that this is different, right? It's not to say that, parents 3, 4, 5, 600 years ago didn't desire the best for their children and their grandchildren and for future generations. Every parent throughout, the long history of humanity has wanted the best for their child. But that dreaming, that desire for living well in the past was not bound up with an expectation of more, an expectation of having more money, having more wealth, having longer lives. It was about how to live well within the limitations and the constraints of the places where we lived. This idea that we are moving upwards, that we're climbing a ladder, that we are increasing our stock, that we are on the cusp of becoming an interplanetary species. This is all new. This is all a new thing, a new ideology, a new mindset, something that is changed. In a past course, I read a line from one of my favorite novels. And I don't remember exactly the line, I don't have it, but it says essentially that in the past, the only thing that really changed in a community was how thick the old growth trees were, how many rings were added to the old growth trees. But people generally expected to be born, to be able to recognize the world that they left from the world that they lived in. There wasn't this drastic change. And again, only in the past couple hundred years have we created a societal moment, a civilizational moment, where we can really expect to see great, grand differences between the lives that we live, the lives that our children are going to live. And as the pace of progress and development continues to grow faster and faster, those changes don't even happen on, the scale of one human lifetime, right? The world that I inhabited when I was a child is drastically different from the world that I inhabit today as a middle-aged man. And I can expect, I think, that the world in 20 or 30 years, when I'm an older person, an elderly man, is going to be significantly different as well. In terms of how we live, what expectations we can have, all of these different technological improvements, things are changing at a faster and faster pace. So this belief, right, this idea of humanity climbing a ladder or scaling a mountain or moving towards something that's ever greater, this idea that's embodied in the Winston Churchill quote, roughly coincides with the growth of the scientific techno-industrial mindset powered by the seemingly endless energy offered by the fossil fuel era. It was kind of like there was this conglomeration of circumstances that came together, starting in the 1700s, 1800s. We had developed, the scientific method, the literary revolution really took off, with the advent of the printing press. The Enlightenment period challenged a lot of the precepts of traditional religion, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And so we had this explosion of knowledge, of scientific seeking, of trying to understand the world, to take it apart, to understand its parts. And then all of a sudden, along with this mindset of wanting to dissect the world and understand it, we found an enormous source of seemingly abundant and limitless energy in the source of coal and oil and natural gas and fossil fuels. So suddenly we had the know-how, and now we had the means to really change the world, to fit our design. So for the first time in history, we had at our fingertips the knowledge and the excess energy to fuel our wildest dreams. Even in the past, the wealthiest emperors, the Genghis Khans, the Alexander the Greats, the Roman emperors, they might have had all of these wildest dreams, but they were limited, very, very limited by They only had so much energy. They only had so much technology at their disposal. There was only so much knowledge that was available to them. So, to think that, people like Genghis Khan, drastically changed the history of the world. But at the same time, the amount of power that was available to even, the cruelest and the most powerful of emperors is available to all of us today. The ability to jump on a plane and fly from one side of the world to the other, to be able to connect with people around the world. These are things that, even the most violent emperors of history could only dream about, right? And the result of this explosion within the last couple hundred years is a world of hockey stick graphs. I don't know if you all know what hockey is, but hockey is a sport popular in Canada, and you use a stick that's kind of shaped like this, where there's a flat end and then really tall kind of stick or handle that you hold on to. And what you see when we talk about hockey stick graphs, the idea is that for almost any type of indicator that you want to measure, if you stretch out that indicator to include at least the past 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years of human history, what you see is generally a very flat line that maybe has the smallest increase over time, and then something happens around between the years of 1800 and 1900. Within the last 200 years, and you see an explosion of almost every different thing. So here we have the global population, right? From the year 10,000 BC, 100,000 BC until about 1800, population was generally the same around the world. There was a slight increase that you can see over time, but nothing drastic. And then something happens in 1800, and our population goes from well under 1 billion, about 400 million people, to around, we're supposed to reach 10 billion people within the next 20 years or so. You see hockey stick graphs, and for example, worldwide, real gross domestic product per capita, meaning, how much money, economic resources we have at our disposal per people. For the longest time, it was generally not changing very much. There was obviously excesses. There were kings and queens and emperors and conquest, people who, royalty, monarchs, etc., who had an enormous amount of wealth. But generally, the general population, we had a very limited amount of economic resources at our disposal. And we talk about economic resources, we're not just talking about money. We're talking about natural goods, land, things that we can purchase, foodstuffs, energy, etc. And so you see this, the hockey stick graph here shows that things generally don't change. There's some minor ups and downs that coincide with, empires that rise and fall, civilizations that rise and fall. One civilization conquers another and has an uptick and then drops. But really, what begins to change again is right after the year 1800, and you start to see this massive amount of growth. And at first, it was, this growth was really took off, in what's known as the developed world, the Western world, so Europe, the United States, certain parts of Japan, and in other sectors around the world. And then more recently, in more recent years, in the past maybe 20 or 30 years, that same kind of uptick of growth we see in other parts of the world, China, India, certain African nations. But all of them are following this hockey stick graph. The same thing we see, for example, in global per capita energy usage, right? For the longest period of time, the amount of energy that was available to the average person was drastically limited, right? You could burn wood, you could use the solar energy that shines on the earth to grow crops. And only in recent years, again, in the post 1800 years, with the advent of fossil fuels, did all of a sudden we discover that there's this enormous source of energy that allows us to fuel all of our projects, all of our desires, everything we want to create and make happen in the world. So you see that. Um, this hockey stick graph kind of examples, can also be looked at from pretty much every type of resource. So, for example, this is just one example of global copper production, right? So, the metal ages, date back to several thousand years ago. But at the same time, the amount of copper or steel or bronze or whatever type of metal we want to talk about, how much of that was available to the average person, how much of that was really produced was fairly limited, right? Because it was limited by how deep you could dig into the ground, how much you could physically take out. And again, it was only in the past 100 years or so, with the advent of fossil fuels and the resulting technologies, that we've been able to extract and mine an enormous amount of resources, every type of metal, every type of resource imaginable. This same type of graph of drastic growth can be seen for timber production, the amount of wood that we extract, the amount of metals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other aspect of the hockey stick graph kind of reality in which we're living is that there's also an enormous amount of growth for negative things, right? And all of the negative growth that we're going to look at here coincides with the same time period, right? So at the same moment that our population was growing, that our GDP per capita was taking off, that the amount of energy and resource usage was starting to balloon upwards. At the same time, we see the extinction rate for birds, mammals, and amphibians also begins this hockey stick type of growth right around 1800, right? We see that you can also look at like an inverted hockey stick graph. So, for example, old growth forest cover was generally more or less stable throughout the world until about 1800 again. And we have to see a quick decline as, again, the technology, the knowledge, the energy at our disposal, and we start to, have these very, very serious effects, in the natural world, which we depend upon. Obviously, climate change is the big one. If we look at temperature change over the past, 10,000 years, one of the hallmarks of the modern era is that humanity, civilization itself developed during a time when Earth's climate has been remarkably stable. If you look back, millions of years, you obviously, you see ice ages and hothouse Earth moments throughout history. But in the history of human civilizations, the temperature has remained remarkably stable. And again, here we see this hockey stick graph type of model that's taken off. Again, this is even more recently than 1800s in the last maybe 50 years. So all of this is we see this massive growth in almost everything, from population to GDP to resource usage, and that coincides with a lot of negative effects as well. The same kind of model of hockey stick growth for climate change, temperature, pollution, etc. Our practical faith in progress has ramified and hardened into sorry, this is a quote from Ronald Wright's book, A Short History of Progress. And he says, our practical faith in progress has ramified and hardened into an ideology, a secular religion, which, like the religions that progress has challenged, is blind to certain flaws in its credentials. Progress, therefore, has become a myth in the anthropological sense. What is myth? Myth is an arrangement of the past, whether real or imagined, in patterns that reinforce a culture's deepest values and aspirations. They are the maps by which cultures navigate throughout time. The myth of progress has sometimes served us well, those of us seated at the best tables anyway, and may continue to do so. But it has also become dangerous. Progress has an internal logic that can lead beyond reason into catastrophe. A seductive trail of successes may end in a trap, right? And I really like the end of that quote. So the idea is that it makes sense. For the past 300 years, we have lived in this world of exploding everything. We're living longer, we have more stuff available to us, we have more energy. And it shouldn't come as a surprise then that, you know, our new religion, our new religiosity is founded on this idea of progress, right? That we believe in it. That again, the quote that's embodied in the Churchill quote. The idea is that we're climbing a ladder, we're ascending a hill, we're moving towards ever greater promises of more wealth, more energy, more things available for us. And one of the things that Ronald Wright says is that this is a religion. This is modern day religion. This is modern day mythos, right? And it because it is a religion, because is a myth, we are unable to really step back and critique that mythology, right? It's something that's again so embedded. It's a modern day certainty, right? But one of the central aspects of a myth is that we're unable to look at how the internal logic within it can lead to very serious excesses that can lead in a trap. So here, this is a quote from the very beginning, the introduction of the book, and he lays out that one of the problems with progress is that as we have success, through the scientific revolution, through enlightenment, through the abundance of energy, through technological development. At the same time, all of these successes tend to accumulate into potential traps, right? So a progress trap is the condition of human societies it's the condition that human societies experience when, in pursuing progress through human ingenuity, they inadvertently introduce novel problems that they do not have the resources nor the political will to solve for fear of short-term losses in status, stability, or quality of life. This prevents further progress and sometimes leads to societal collapse. So we have, if you look at these two images, the kind of modern day mythos of progress is that, we started, you can take it back to evolutionary theory that, we came from the savannas of Africa and we went turned from apes into people, into, hunter and gatherer societies. And then the Neolithic revolution, we started the farming that led to the accumulation of a surplus, which led to civilizations. Civilizations led to deeper thought, and that's eventually led to the theory of relativity, and that we're going to continue on. And the modern day kind of priests and priestesses of the religion of progress, people like Elon Musk, talk about it's just a matter of time before we become an interplanetary species. Elon Musk is going to take the first group of people to Mars, and then from there, our rocket ships will take us into this Star Trek type of future, right? It's this idea that we're on this continued path upwards. Obviously, the other one is that at the same time, we were having this development. One of the developments that Ronald Wright looks at that he sees as a progress trap is, for example, the development of weapons. Weapons were a fundamentally important aspect in the development of the human species, right? We were able to develop certain tools that allowed us to hunt animals. And then certain civilizations developed other types of warfare tools that allowed them to both protect themselves and also to conquer other nations. And the development of weapons, of weaponry, has came to the point that now humanity has enough nuclear weapons that we have the technological and knowledge ability to wipe out life on Earth. Is that is that a positive development, or is that a trap of progress? There's a couple other examples of what progress traps might be. So, for example, if we go back to the 1800s, there was a very, very real problem there was a growth in urban areas and cities around the world, but people still moved by horse and carriage, by horse and buggy, and there was a very real problem with horse manure building up in these growing cities because people took their horses into the city and there was poop all over the place that led to all sorts of issues with public health. So eventually that led to the development of the internal combustion engine. We were able to fix the problem of contamination of horse manure in our cities by developing the car. If you fast forward a couple hundred years, now what we see is we have enormous amounts of traffic, urban air pollution. Obviously, the internal combustion engine has led to or contributed to climate change as well. Another example of a progress trap is that growing population. Back in the years after World War II, led to the threat of food shortages. We saw that the global population had gone from 1 billion, 2 billion to 3 billion. And there was a lot of talk about global famine. How are we going to feed a population that seems to be inevitably growing by 1 billion people every generation or two? And so what happened is we developed the Green Revolution, the introduction of all sorts of synthetic agricultural inputs, from synthetic fertilizers to pesticides to herbicides, etc. And for the first time, we were able to control how much how much nutrients plant got and we're receiving, and there was this massive growth in yields, in agricultural yields, and we were able to stave off supposedly mass starvation and famine and things like that. Again, we fast forward a couple hundred years, and those supposed benefits, as Ronald Wright said, the seductive trail of successes may end in a trap. And so what we see today is, because of the Green Revolution technologies, we see massive losses of topsoil, novel health threats from all of the synthetic chemicals that are bioaccumulating in the world. And today we see new threats of food shortages. The United Nations recently said that if we do not change how industrial agriculture is operating, we only have enough fertile topsoil left in the world for about another 40 or 50 harvests. Obviously that's a critical threshold that we've crossed, right? And one of the things that we see in these examples of progress traps is that most of the crises that modernity faces today are the direct result of the developed solutions to past crises, right? We try to develop a solution to a crisis, it fixes something, but it eventually leads to mostly even worse and more serious effects down the road. Um, Ronald Wright believes that the central problem leading to progress traps is one of scale and political will. He says that technology is addictive. Material progress creates problems that are, or at least seem to be, solvable or soluble only further progress, or seem to be solvable only by further progress. Again, the devil here is in the scale. A good bang can be useful, a better bang can end the world. The error is often to extrapolate from what appears to work well on a small scale to a larger scale, which depletes natural resources, causes environmental degradation. Large-scale implementation also tends to subject to diminishing returns. So the central kind of thesis behind progress traps is that small groups of humans experiment with things, are always trying to figure out how to make things better, how to live a little bit better lives. We might be hardwired, we're going to talk about that here in just a second, to try and seek out easier solutions, more convenience, more ease, more efficiency, more technique, right? Um, and once we find that and something works on a small scale, we want to try to, more people want to copy that, to introduce that shortcut into their own lives. And so we start to we try to universalize certain solutions, right? And that has led to, today's interconnected and globalized world. This phenomena of false extrapolation occurs in a homogenized, unipolar world where pretty much every culture, every people, every nation seeks similar ideas of material progress. We all want the same thing. We all want to live, like people in the so-called first world. We've kind of homogenized desire, this idea that cultures used to be categorically different one from the other, and today things are people generally aspire to the same ideas, the same levels of material comfort, material wealth, etc. Um, but before we move on from that, a few other historical examples of how progress traps occur and how they've affected, past human societies, human groups, human civilizations. So in the late Pleistocene, in Pleistocene was the historical era when we were still mostly hunter and gatherers spread out around the world. And there was a moment, and it happened in different cultures around the world. It didn't just happen in one, but it happened almost in similar times, both in the North American continent, in Africa. But hunter and gatherer groups began to develop improved hunting techniques in vulnerable areas. And this eventually led to the extinction of most of the megafauna species that left the enlarged populace without an adequate food supply. So one of the things, if you go back into the fossil record, there used to be all sorts of megafaunas, the woolly mammoths, these gigantic sloths used to be all around Central America where I live. All of these, huge turtles, several, these massive fossils that, came after the dinosaur era. But coexisted with hunter and gatherer human societies. And because these megafauna were generally kind of slow, easy to kill, our hunter and gatherers learned how to kill off these massive populations, and within a couple generations, a lot of these megafaunas were extinguished by people. A kind of a more recent example, there were several Native American groups before the conquest of the New World by the Europeans the historical and archaeological record shows that they were forced to migrate in many cases because they developed new ways of hunting buffalo. So what they would do instead of hunting one or two buffalo, they would try and lead these buffaloes into what's called a buffalo jump, where the buffalo were forced in mass to jump off of these massive cliffs because they were being corralled by Native Americans. And for one winter, they were able to kill an enormous amount of buffalo by essentially driving them over these cliffs and having them jump to their death. And that was extremely it was a drastic increase and improvement in hunting technology. Instead of killing one or two with bows and arrows, you were able to kill several dozen, several hundred bison or buffalo all at once. The problem was that the perfection of this hunting technique eventually spelled the end of hunting as a way of life. Right, because more meat led to greater populations, better hunting techniques. Didn't allow the population to reproduce of the animals, and eventually, people had to develop different ways to survive. So one of the precursors of the Neolithic Revolution, of the agricultural revolution, was the fact that people had hunted to death, the species they depended upon. At the same time, the agricultural revolution that happened between 5 and 10,000 years ago is also an agricultural trap. And we see that through several different civilizations that have risen and fallen throughout the world. The ancient Sumerians are just one example, perhaps one of the first examples. The Sumerians were one of the first civilizations to adopt agriculture as a way of life. And they came up with these fascinating irrigation systems where they were able to move water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Middle East long distances, and they are essentially able to make the desert bloom. So in these very dry, arid regions, they were able to irrigate the crops. But what they didn't know was that these massive irrigation systems led to soil salinization, where over several years, over a generation or two, the soil built up salt, and eventually to the point that crops could no longer be grown, and there was an agricultural collapse. The Sumerians' brilliant development of irrigation for agriculture eventually brought so much salt into the soil that wheat could not be grown, and you see this drastic collapse in population. So the same question can be asked there: will the perfection of dominion over nature lead to the end of farming as a way of nourishment? Are we seeing a similar pattern in how, the green revolution in industrial agriculture is, creating the conditions for its own demise? Who knows? And even on a larger scale, on a civilizational scale, Imperial Rome, the gold standard of old civilizations, developed an enormous empire that allowed urban life to flourish in urban centers around the empire. However, as the empire became increasingly dependent on food imports from a far-flung empire, the complexity of that system simply could not sustain itself, and that contributed to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The question I think we can ask then, if we follow this kind of pathway of progress traps, will the perfection of the civilizational hubris of wanting to create a world of our own design lead to the end of the experiment of civilization in and of itself? Is civilization itself a progress trap? The idea of concentrating people in urban areas, of specializing in certain areas, of moving people away from land-based agrarian livelihoods, where our economies depend directly on the spaces where we live. Is that itself, a progress trap that's bound to end in failure? This is a kind of a long quote from Ronald Wright's book. He says that civilization is an experiment, a very recent way of life in the human career, and it has a habit of walking into what I am calling progress traps. A small village on good land beside a river is a good idea, but when that village grows into a city and paves over the good land, it becomes a bad idea. While prevention might have been easy, a cure may be impossible, because a city isn't easily moved. That's one of the foundational aspects of progress traps, that at certain moments in the development of a civilization, a way of life, whatever, there are ways to kind of counteract to avoid certain things. But as we continue, along this path of progress, becomes harder and harder to avoid, to go backwards, to evade some of the very negative aspects that come. This human inability to foresee or to watch out for long range consequences may be inherent to our kind, shaped by the millions of years when we lived hand to mouth by hunting and gathering. It may also be little more than a mix of inertia, greed, and foolishness, encouraged by the shape of the social pyramid. The, oops, the concentration of power at the top of large-scale societies gives the elite a vested interest in the status quo. They continue to prosper in darkening times long after the environment and general populace begin to suffer, right? So what Ronald Wright is getting at there is that what exactly are the causes of this progress trap? Why, throughout history, for the past at least 50,000 years, do groups of humans seem to follow this pattern of finding something that works, and then throwing themselves into it with such vigor and gusto that we're unable to see that if we continue doing things, it's going to lead to the collapse. Why are we not able to see and analyze and scrutinize what might be the long-term effects of living the way we do? Why didn't our the hunter and gatherers understand that if they killed all of the buffalo or all of the megafauna, that they would run out of meat to eat? Why wasn't the ancient Sumerian farmer able to see that if he didn't change the way he grew crops, the soil was going to fail, right? What is it within us? And one of the things that Wright says in this quote here is that, well, it could be that we're hardwired for that. There's a lot of interesting neuroscientific research being done that says that maybe the human brain is simply hardwired to fall into these progress traps. We all have inherited the deep-rooted neural systems and patterns and connections of hundreds of thousands of years of cognitive evolution as hunters and gatherers. Today, however, the techno-industrial system we live in requires different ways of reacting to the effects of the lives on our world. There's a lot of interesting quotes from neuroscientists. One is this guy named Ian McGilchrist, and he says, look, our neural pathways, our brains have been created by hundreds of thousands of years of living as hunters and gatherers, right? At the same time, we live in a world that is not a hunter and gatherer world. It is fundamentally different. And so there's a lot of saying that our brains simply are not created to think long term, to consider the complex effects, the cause and effects of our actions, because for the longest time we lived in a completely different environment. This book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Embassy also provides really interesting neurological insight into behaviors where predominant attention to short-term interests might compromise long-term outcomes. And there's this idea, he's a neuroscientist, Ian McGilchrist, and he looks at how the different hemispheres of the brain interact, and how modernity, the world in which we live in today, uses the part of the brain or focuses on the on the part of the brain, the hemisphere of the brain that only looks at short-term benefits, right? We're always thinking about what can we do to improve, our livelihoods in the short term without really thinking about the long-term effects. Ronald Wright says, to use a computer analogy, we are running 21st century software on hardware that was last upgraded 50,000 years ago or more. On the other hand, the progress traps of modernity are also deeply embedded into structures of power and wealth, where the interests of these groups of power and wealth further our entrenchment into the traps. The collapse of past civilizations was often spurred on by the growing levels of inequality and the excesses of the powerful and oligarchic classes. Today, obviously, all of us enjoy, the benefits of modernity and the benefits of fossil fuels that are available to us. But at the same time, fossil fuel companies, PFAS manufacturers, the billionaire class of technology sector today, all of them have embedded interests, economic and power interests in sustaining the status quo. So another reason that progress traps occur is not only because of the neuroscience of our brains, but also because there are people who consider their own well-being above that of the others. That's obviously something we have to take into account. So kind of to end with, I'd like to introduce a few ideas about how we might challenge the modern day religion or mythos of progress, right? How can we kind of take a step back from the last 300 years, question the modern certainty of what progress is? Wright says in his book that the reform that is needed is not anti-capitalist or anti-socialist or anti-American or anti-West or even deep environmentalist. It's simply the transition from short-term to long-term thinking. We need to develop the ability as individuals, as communities, as cultures, as nations to think long term. And that thinking long term also requires thinking about the second, third, and fourth order effects of what we're doing, right? We can't just think about, how are we going to solve this problem? We have to think about how we solve one problem and try to think about how that's going to affect a whole host of other factors and effects within. We have to develop the ability to really think deeply about, how what we're living, how we are living is going to affect our lives in the future and the lives of future generations. C.S. Lewis, who was a thinker, a writer back in the 1950s, 60s, he says that progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turn, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man or the woman, the person who turns back soonest is the most progressive man or woman. And I like that idea because a lot of times we have this idea that we're on this upward pathway and the only way forward is through, right? The only way forward through the meta crisis, the ecological social crises that are compounding in today's world is to continue to move forward, to expect a techno utopia that, whatever problem or crises that we're facing today, just kind of we affirm our belief that further progress and technological development will get us out, right? We might be, drastically warming, heating the planet, but, eventually our scientists will figure out a way to, geoengineer the world so we can get rid of global warming. We might be destroying the ecological basis of the soil where we grow our food, but we just have to affirm that, one day we'll be able to grow food in laboratories and we won't have to worry about farming anymore. That's kind of the techno utopia belief that there's always going to be a technological solution. But what C.S. Lewis says is that that's not what we need to think of. We need to reinvent what the idea of progress is. Progress is about getting near to the place we want to be. And most human beings have a generally fair and shared idea of what it means to live well, right? To be healthy, to have what we need, to have human community, to have a sense of belonging and placement. And if the world that we're living in today is not leading towards that, true progress is about turning backwards, trying to find out where we went wrong instead of deepening, getting stuck in the mire of progress by just continuing to move forward. A lot of time, what we might need is to turn backwards and rethink things. One of the things that I find a lot of hope in is that this kind of questioning of progress is not something that's new. It's happened throughout history. There's always been sectors of society and people who have looked at, the general direction of where progress is taking us and said, this isn't right. We need to rethink this. We need to go back to somewhere else. We need to find out where we took the wrong turn. Ovid was a Roman poet that was contemporary of Jesus Christ, actually, back, 2,000 years ago. And in the height of the Roman Empire, when the Rome was expanding and taking over, and, growing an enormous amount of wealth and power, expanding itself around the entire Mediterranean Sea and into Africa and Asia, Ovid was a fierce critic of this type of development because he saw what was occurring. And he said, in one of his poems, he says, Earth has better things to offer. crops without cultivation, fruit on the bough, honey in the hollow oak. No one tore the ground with plowshares, or parceled out the land, or swept the sea with dipping oars. The shore was the world's end. So it's kind of this, moving against this imperial ambition and the ambition of agricultural development to tear apart the soil and the earth. He says, clever human nature, victim of your inventions, disastrously creative. Why cordon cities with towered walls? Why arm for war? Right? Ovid could be writing about the modern day world, but this was a sentiment that's 2,000 years old. So there's always been this sector of people who said, let's rethink these modern day certainties of progress. Um, uh, the lesson that I read in the past is this, that the health of the land and water can be the only lasting basis for any civilization's survival and its success. That's a quote from Ronald Wright. He says that really, the hallmark, what we need to really measure progress by, is how healthy we leave the world for future generations. So I'm going to say, to end with, 4 ideas about how all of us today can kind of continue this ethos of what Ovid offers, for challenging and rethinking progress, right? I think questioning the mythos of progress idea, rethinking progress begins with questioning the mythos of the progress idea, of understanding the anomaly of modernity in historical terms, understanding that there is something drastically different about the world we live in today. It also begins with challenging the comforts, the conveniences, the efficiencies that the ruling class sells us for our acquiescence. And lastly, to develop the ability to consider long-term effects of our lives and livelihoods, and to respond honestly to the limitations inherent in living in place. Those are kind of, I think, 4 tasks that are held out for us. And I'll go ahead and end my presentation right there and yeah, open up the floor. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. So thank you.